So you book yourself a great holiday, you know, there's some iconic locations you want to photograph, but how are you going to avoid all those people who are going to be there at the same time? Now, if you Google this, they'll say things like, well, you can remove them in post-processing, or just go along at a quiet time of day. Now, unless it's the lockdown, as you can see here in this little clip of St. Mark's Square in Venice, chances are, even if you go early in the morning, it's still going to have some people hanging around there. So the best way to take a photo and avoid getting any people into your shot is actually to use a really long exposure. Now, you can approach this in two ways. You can take a creative decision to say, actually, I want some movement and I'm just going to blur the people, in which case your exposure time doesn't have to be that long, less than a minute, something like 20 seconds will probably do, and you'll get a dynamic shot like I've got here in this shot of a reception area of a building with some people moving through. But if you're photographing a truly iconic landmark, you probably don't want to have any people there at all. Now that's a lot more tricky. The best way to do it is have an exposure time that's over 5 minutes. So if you look at this time lapse of St. Mark's Square, you'll see that the people are moving around through the scene all the time. There's nobody stood exactly in front of you for a long period of time. So if you set your exposure for 5 minutes, what your camera is going to do, it's going to look at the background for the whole length of the exposure, but the people are just going to flit across the scene. And that means what will get burned onto your sensor is the background, because that's what the camera is seeing continuously. And you'll end up then with a nice shot without any people in there. Now, those of you who have watched my video last week will know I've been doing a project on black and white fine art photography. I don't want any people in these shots. So I went along to the Millennium Bridge in Lancaster, and you can see this is how I've got my camera set up. And you can see this is a little video clip I shot at the time. It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, this is one of the problems when people say to you, go at a quiet time of day. If it's winter, it might only be daylight between 8 and 5, in which case, chances are there are always going to be people there. And this was the case here. It's a busy pedestrian bridge with cyclists and pedestrians walking across it all the time. But I had an exposure time 5.5 minutes. And that meant that all the people going through the scene would only be perhaps in my camera's frame for 20 or 30 seconds. So the rest of the time, the camera is looking at the bridge every time. And that's what's burned onto the sensor. So I ended up with this photo, which was then able to convert into a black and white shot like this. Now, you might occasionally get caught out when somebody does stand in your frame the whole time you're taking the shot. Here's another example I took on Morecambe Promenade, and you can see there's a guy sat here and a cyclist would come along and stopped and talked to him. Now, the guy who's standing is just obviously moving around. This is about a 3.5 to 4 minute exposure, and you've got some ghosting here which looks rather unpleasant. The guy who sat down doesn't bother me. He's stayed nice and sharp because he sat down and hasn't really moved, but I really want to remove this ghost who stood next to him, and so I would simply do that in Photoshop. And that's what you're going to have to do if somebody really does stand in your photo for a long time. But hopefully, if you choose the right viewpoint, choose a time of day where it is likely to be a little bit quieter, then the long exposure will work for you really well. So the process is, you're going to need an ND filter. In fact, you probably need two. For my shot in Lancaster, I used a 16 stop, so that was a 10 stop and a 6 stop ND filter combined. So set your camera up as you would normally and meter your exposure. And I'd recommend you spot meter off an average part of the scene, and by average I mean something that would be interpreted as mid-grey. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, I recommend you watch this video that I'll link to up here that explains how a camera's metering system works. So you find a very neutral part of the scene, meter off that and take a note of your exposure. Now, to calculate what exposure time you will need with your filters applied, this is a formula you need. So it's 2 to the power of the filters you're using. So if you're using a 16 stop, as I am in my case, it's 2 to the power of 16 divided by your shutter speed without the filters applied. So if that was 100th, divide it by 100th, and you'd end up with this. A much more simpler way is to use a long exposure app, and in that case you then just set the kind of ND filter you've got, the number of stops it's got, whether that be 6, 10 or 16. You set the shutter speed that you've metered, and then up at the top it tells you what the real shutter speed you'll need when the filter's put on. So having got that, you can set your camera to manual, and you'll need it on the bulb setting. Now if you're lucky enough to have an option that allows you to alter the bulb timer, as it does on my Sony a7R5, you go into bulb settings, set the amount of time that you want the bulb timer on for. So you set that up in this menu here. It's in the exposure menu, goes to bulb timer settings, and then you input the number of settings. Make sure you save that. Then you can come out, you can put your camera into manual, put your shutter speed to bulb, have the aperture the same as what you metered the scene as previously, and then you take your shot. And it's as simple as that, and you'll end up with something like this, which is what I had before I converted it to black and white. So if you found that useful and you're looking for some more tips on photography, please do subscribe to the channel and like the video. And if there's something else you'd like to see, by all means leave a comment below. In the meantime, go out and practice this and have some fun with your camera. I look forward to seeing you next time.